Simple English sentences can be a verb, like number 1, go. That is a very small English sentence. Number 2, an English sentence can have a subject plus a verb, such as I will go. Or an English sentence can have a subject and a verb and an object. Children love their parents. Parents are loved by their children. We know that, but verbs can be active or passive. Subjects that come before active verbs do the verb. So, in the sentence, children love their parents, the children are the subjects and love is the action. Okay? So love is the verb and the children are doing the love. Okay? So children, the subjects, are doing the verb. They do the love. But if your verb is passive, subjects before passive verbs don't do the verb. These verbs are called passive verbs. So something happens to the subject. Parents are loved. The parents are not doing the love. Someone else is doing the love. And in the second example, it tells us who. Parents are loved by their children. The second example shows us who is doing the verb. The children. Okay? So parents is still the subject, but the parents are not doing the verb in those two examples. So those two are passive verbs. Let's look at some more active and passive verbs. So active and passive verbs can be used in the present, the past, and future tenses. This means there are lots of different types of active verbs and passive verbs, okay? So let's look at number 1. Children love their parents. Now the subject is children and the verb is love. Who is doing the love? Who is doing the verb? The children are doing the verb. So the subject is doing the verb. So this is an active verb. And the verb we know is present simple. So let's look at number 2. Parents are loved by their children. Okay, let's look for the verb, are loved. Now let's look for the subject, parents. Who is doing the verb? The children are doing the verb. So the subject, parents, are not doing the verb. So this is a passive verb. But this is also a present simple passive verb. Okay? Let's look at number 3. The rain is watering the garden. Let's look for the verb first. Is watering. And the subject, the rain. What is doing the verb? The rain is doing the verb. So the subject is doing the verb. The rain is watering the garden. So this is an active verb. Let's look at number 4. The garden is being watered. Okay, the verb is being watered. The subject, the garden. But what is doing the watering? Is the garden watering itself? No, it's not. Something else is doing the watering. So the subject in number 4 is not doing the verb. So this is a passive verb. It is a present continuous passive. Let's look at number 5. He has watered the garden. Let's look for the verb. Has watered. The subject, he. Who is doing the verb? He is doing the verb. So the subject is doing the verb. So this is an active verb sentence. And we know has watered. This is a present perfect verb. Number 6. The garden has been watered. The verb is has been watered. The subject is the garden. Who has been doing the watering? The garden? No, something else has been doing the verb. So the subject in this sentence is not doing the verb. So this is a passive verb or a passive sentence. But the verb has been watered. We call it a present perfect passive. Let's look at number 7. I drove the car to Coles yesterday. The verb is drove. It's a past simple verb. And the subject, I. Who is doing the verb? I, the subject, is doing the verb. So this verb is an active verb. And let's look at number 8. The car was driven to Coles yesterday. The verb was driven. Okay, so the subject, the car. What was doing the driving? What was doing the verb? The car does drive, but the car cannot drive itself. Someone has to do the driving, okay? So the subject in number 8 is not doing the verb. So this is a passive sentence with a passive verb. And was driven is a past simple passive verb. Number 9. I was driving my car to the hospital when you rang. Let's look at the first verb, was driving. The subject, I. Who is doing the driving? I. The subject is doing the verb. So this is an active verb. And the verb was driving is the past progressive or past continuous verb. Let's look at number 10. The car was being driven to the hospital when you rang. So number 9 and 10 are very similar, but one's an active and one's a passive. Okay? So number 9 was the active. I was doing the driving. But number 10, the car. The car is not doing the driving. Something else is doing the driving in the car. Okay? So the subject, the car, is not doing the verb. So was being driven is a passive verb and it is a past continuous passive. Okay? So number 9 and number 10 are both past continuous, but one is active and one is passive. Let's look at number 11. We have finished the movie. We had finished the movie when you arrived. The verb is had finished. This is a past perfect verb. The subject is we. And who had finished? We had finished. So the subject did the verb. So this is an active verb. Number 12. The movie had been finished when you arrived. So the verb had been finished, the subject, the movie. The movie didn't finish itself. Someone else watched the movie and finished it. So this is a passive sentence, and the passive verb had been finished is a past perfect passive. Number 13. We will bake the bread tomorrow. The verb will bake. This is the future. The subject is we. Who will do the verb? Who will bake? We. The subject will bake. So this is an active verb, and the subject is doing the verb. And number 14, very similar. The bread will be baked tomorrow. So the verb will be baked. That's the verb, and the bread is the subject. Okay? So the bread doesn't bake itself. Someone else puts the bread in the oven and bakes it. Okay? So it's actually the oven that bakes the bread. So the bread is not doing the verb. So this is a passive verb, and it is a future passive. So how do we make the passive verb? Remember, passive verbs, something happens to the subject. We form the passive with the to be verb plus the past participle. For example, was married, is eaten, was eaten, was born, am called, is named. Okay? So the subject doesn't do the verb. Something happens to the subject. Let's look at the first example with the bullet point, the dot point. The baby is named Tom. This sentence is passive because the baby didn't name itself. Someone else named the baby. So we can use a passive verb because the subject, the baby, didn't do the naming, okay? The baby didn't name itself. Let's look at the next example. The cake was eaten yesterday. The cake doesn't eat itself. The cake is the subject, and was eaten is the verb, but something else did the eating. So this is a passive verb. We don't actually know who ate the cake. All we know is that the cake was eaten yesterday. Let's look at the last example. 2 young girls were saved by a lifeguard at the swimming pool last weekend. 2 young girls, this is the subject. The verb were saved is the verb. Now the girls did not do the verb. The girls did not save themselves. The lifeguard saved them, okay? So in this example, the subject is not doing the verb, so it's a passive verb. And we can look at all those 3 verbs, is named, was eaten, were saved. They all start with the verb to be, is, was, were. And then they have the past participle, named, eaten, saved. So this is a clue to being able to recognize a passive verb.